Hey, it's Matthew Todd and welcome to the next lesson in this module. In this lesson, I want to introduce the strategy of testing for purpose. For me, this is the most important part of this course. It's the enabler for when we get to the next module where we talk about refactoring. But more importantly, it's the single most important thing I've come to realise after many years of writing software, being a lead developer, and in coaching development teams and developers one-on-one on testing. And it actually isn't about TDD, it's not about whether you write the test first. This strategy applies even if you choose to write the test after the fact. It might be slightly harder because you've got to familiarise yourself with how the code works after it's been written, but it still applies. Now, you could also argue this extends even beyond testing. Some of what we might talk about in this lesson might seem like a subtle change in what you're doing, but do not make the mistake of thinking this is not important or not have an impact. I can assure you that it will. I've seen how this can shift the mindset of a developer in how they approach their tests, which means it becomes much easier to consistently, not just a one-off, but consistently create the right tests, and for those tests to be written in a way that illustrates their purpose, they serve their purpose, and they're easy and clear to understand. They're easy to maintain in the future, and they enable rapid development. They enable things like refactoring with confidence. They give you much more confidence in the code you're creating in doing what it should do, in meeting its requirements. This is why, as part of this module, there is a practical coding exercise for you to complete, and I really do want you to show me the code. Let me see your commits, and I'll suggest improvements, tweaks you can make that will really help you get what we're talking about here. It will enable you to unit test code and take a test-driven approach with a lot more confidence, and ultimately deliver solid code in much less time. But before we get into all of that, what do I mean by testing for purpose? So, testing for purpose is a strategy for writing tests, and we've already covered test setup and how we can organise and structure our tests, not only around the units they're testing, but also the preconditions relating to the system under test, allowing us to have very well-defined, precise test setup methods that don't contain any fluff that isn't relevant to some of the test methods. So, testing for purpose is about the next steps. So from our test structure before, we know we have test setup, followed by execute and verify. And as mentioned before, the cleanup stage is something I try and avoid. Testing for purpose is about the execution and the verification. It's about our test methods or functions themselves actually look like. Throughout the course, I'll use the terms method and function interchangeably. But it's the same thing. It's the block of code that forms your actual executable test. It doesn't matter object-oriented or functional, the same principles apply and the exact same strategies can be used. So, testing for purpose is how we think about these test methods, how we approach them, what they're for, and therefore what these methods actually look like. So for me, I think that test code, it should be maintainable. That is about an aspect of the code that exists after the fact, after we've written the code. We can probably break this down a bit into further attributes that maintainable code should have. Could be that it's easy to read, we know what to expect from our test code, etc. And we'll talk more about how we achieve this when it comes to the actual TFP strategy, but for now just recognise this is something we can agree we should strive for. It should be obvious to write it. This is the counterpart to the above for new test code. We know what to expect from existing tests and can articulate specifically what that is. Then those same properties that apply to the existing code would also apply to new code that we create. And this removes the barrier to creating new tests because many of the decisions have already been made. For any new test we write, we know exactly what should and should not be in it. We aren't overwhelmed by decisions then, we can just focus on writing our test and application code. So hopefully no one disagrees with those. In themselves, those principles, statements aren't useful, but they are what is behind the strategy of testing for purpose. And I believe that with any techniques, tools, strategies you apply, you do need to have solid principles behind them and recognise what they are in order to succeed. In order to make decisions, you should have those principles in mind. They give you an important context in which to evaluate any decisions that you make. So, if we want our test code to be maintainable, as we said, we should know what to expect from the code. And for new test code, we should know exactly what should and should not go into each test method. When talking about test patterns and anti-patterns, many people will tell you things like, don't have too many assertions, don't have long test methods. Statements like these aren't in themselves useful though. Who is to say what too long means and what we mean by having too many assertions? And if I delete some of the assertions, is that okay? And if so, which ones should I delete? For me, without digging any deeper, a lot of statements that people like to throw around like these, they're just superficial. And I agree, yes, tests shouldn't be too long, shouldn't have too many assertions, but I don't think purely having those attributes is what makes a good test. So in digging deeper, thinking about those principles, thinking about some of the anti-patterns, but digging deeper, thinking about what's really going on, when some of us have a gut feel for why this code isn't clean, it's led me to create this strategy I'm calling testing for purpose. So in a nutshell, at a high level, testing for purpose, as I hope the name implies, is about saying that for every single unit test we create, test-driven or not, it should serve a clear and specific purpose. What I want you to do in the rest of this lesson is dig into what that means and how we can take specific actions to ensure that's the case. Some of the things I'll describe as part of this strategy, as I've said before, depending on how you're currently working, and they may seem like subtle changes, but please don't ignore them. When I've coached developers in this, even subtle tweaks can have a massive impact and affect your mindset, affect the way you approach these tests. So at testing for purpose, we're saying each test should serve a clear and specific purpose. So let's break this down. By saying it should have a clear and specific purpose, I'm saying that each test method should only be testing a specific thing. This might sound obvious, you might think you're already doing this, but I can say that most, and I don't mean many, I actually do mean most tests that people create are not testing one specific thing. And by one specific thing, I do not mean one specific method or function. I do not mean that in a calculator example, we should have a single test method to test addition, to test calling the add method. We had multiple test methods that were all calling our add method. By one specific thing, I'm talking about one single piece of behaviour. This does not necessarily mean just one assertion in any individual test. We could have multiple assertions in a test, but just because we can assert on something in a test doesn't mean that we should. With our calculator example from the last module, we call the add method of our calculator when two values are on the stack in two separate tests. In one, we were concerned about stack manipulation when performing calculations, and in the other, we were purely concerned with the result of the calculation to ensure the calculation itself was correct. Now, many people would have put this in the same test, thinking in terms of the method being tested and all of the things we could possibly verify when calling this method. But this is why I talk about this as a change in mindset. This would have been the wrong thing to do, because it's making the test all about the execute part of the test setup, part of the test structure. If you do this, then the test will become brittle and hard to maintain. Instead, by making each individual test not only about the action, but also the preconditions, the state our system is in before we test it, as well as the behaviour that we care about, it can be clear from looking at the existing test exactly what the purpose of this test is, hence testing for purpose. For new tests, using this strategy means when it comes to planning or writing a test, we know exactly what it should do, exactly what the purpose of any new test is, and therefore exactly what's necessary in the implementation of the test itself. Everything in the test method will be directly related to that test purpose, to that specific piece of behaviour being tested. So if testing for purpose is about each test method serving a clear and specific purpose, we've talked about what we mean by each test method existing to purely verify a specific piece of behaviour. This will massively help with clarity. By serving to verify a specific piece of behaviour, each test method is going to be short and readable. It's not a direct goal in itself, it's a secondary benefit we get by structuring our test this way. And I'd go further than this though, and make the test method or function definition itself describe the purpose that the test is serving. Yes, the test method name or test definition should describe the purpose. From reading the test method name, I would expect to understand the preconditions required from the test, and exactly what our expectations are about the behaviour we are verifying. This is something I love to cover when doing this course in person, and I always pause to let that sink in and observe people's reactions. It typically ranges from triggering some thoughts in their minds about how they would name some of the tests they've been working on, to horror. Depending on the group size, there's always one or two people who will be genuinely shocked that I could be creating a method name more than a handful of characters in length. Some people would seemingly prefer hiding the reason for the test existing inside the body of the test, giving it a more ambiguous name rather than make the test purpose crystal clear from the test definition itself. So, to summarise, testing for purpose is a strategy we can use to define what tests we should create, define how we should name those tests, and it allows us to determine precisely what needs to go in each test method based on that test purpose. I want to leave it here for now to let this sink in because I think this is massively important. I've used this strategy myself in my own code and also coach teams to do the same. And through purely this practice alone, I've seen many teams go from being viewed as unproductive or poor performers, delivering poor quality code late. I've seen teams go from this to being viewed as the most productive, reliable teams capable of delivering excellent quality code reliably. Teams to be trusted to deliver. And that genuinely is through adopting the strategy and mindset when it comes to testing and taking a test-first approach. I look forward to seeing the next lesson where I'll expand on testing for purpose so we can see what this looks like in practice and demonstrate some of the subtleties associated with this.